Chapter 18. Sarah Connor's Estancia, Paraguay, the present. Sarah stroked the puppy's velvet ears and laughed when he began to wag his tail and tried to lick her. A wiggling puppy amid the stink of burned propellant and scorched flesh. Actually, this little guy is a good argument for why we always ought to have a dog, she said. When it comes to Terminators, there's no early warning system more effective. We can't take him with us, Mom, John said. He shifted the little dog's weight, much as I'd like to. He's too young and he's completely untrained. He'd be a danger to us and to himself. I know. She leaned in and nuzzled the puppy, who redoubled his efforts to lick everything in sight. With a sigh, she turned to Dieter. You'll have to take him home with you. And, if you would be so kind, please take my horse, Linda, as well. Looking over, she saw that he had a hitch attached to his car. Would you mind getting the trailer set up while John and I police the area? She asked. Police? Dieter looked confused. We have to break that up into unrecognizable pieces, she explained, pointing to the defunct Terminator. Then we'll burn down the house around it. You might want to hurry then, Dieter said with a nod towards the house. It looks like the fire in the living room is taking hold. Shit, Sarah said. John, get our stuff out of there. I'll take care of this. We'll take care of this, Dieter amended. He noticed that John put the dog down and jogged towards the house without a word. Good training, he thought, impressed by the young man's discipline. It was as if the faces of the people he'd first met were peeling away like masks, and beneath were, well, people pretty much like these, ready to fight or run for their lives at any moment. Without asking, Sarah reached over, unbuckled and pulled off Dieter's belt, yanking it from around his waist in one smooth move, startling him. Then she knelt and put it through Harold's collar, making a leash, which she then handed to Dieter. Von Rossbach laughed. I'll just put him in the car, he said, and led the puppy away. He looked over his shoulder. I'll be back. Sarah nodded absently. She went over to the woodpile and picked up the axe. Then she turned to the Terminator's severed legs, still jittering strangely on the ground. Damn, she said softly, and lofted the axe. By the time Dieter returned, she had the feet and lower legs separated and was working on the hips. He had brought a crowbar from the toolkit he kept in his trunk and a massive pair of bolt cutters. He placed his foot on one of the lower leg pieces and began to work the crowbar, wrenching until it came apart. The flesh and blood made it a gruesome task, despite the metal clearly visible beneath. He fought down his disgust and kept doggedly working the pieces apart. If Sarah could do it, so could he. John came out in a few minutes and dropped a couple of cases. He was wearing a huge backpack. He swung it down to the ground with a grunt and then picked up the separated pieces of the Terminator, trotting back into the house with them. Sarah looked up as he went in, her face grim. She evaluated the progress of the fire and redoubled her efforts at chopping the Terminator apart. Here, Dieter said, reaching for the axe. I think I'll make more progress on that than you can. Why don't you start with the bolt cutters?" She nodded and handed it over without a word. He was right, and they had the fire to consider. Time for discussion was a luxury. John came out and gathered a second load. He was back in a much shorter time. "We'll have to throw the rest in," he said, shouting over the roar of the fire. Sarah just nodded and kept on with her work. John hefted the crowbar and went looking for the head. He slid one end of the bar into an eye socket and lifted it up to examine it. 2 rounds had gone completely through the skull, and the components rattled around inside. Some mangled pieces fell out through the holes. The problem with this thing was that it was a good, solid piece of workmanship. Breaking it up was going to be a stone bitch. "I think you'll get further using this," Dieter said from beside him. He offered the axe to John, and John took it. He checked the edge and found it very chipped and dull. He gave von Rossbach a lopsided smile. "Maybe so, but not much further." "There's a trick to it," Dieter said. "Put it down and I'll show you." John lowered the head to the ground and worked the crowbar out of the eye socket. Then he made an inviting gesture and stood back. Von Rossbach lifted the axe, the muscles on his arms bulging, and brought it down lightly, just touching the Terminator's skull, lifted it again and brought it down as though making sure of his aim. John watched him attentively as Dieter brought the axe up a final time, and then brought it down with an unstoppable, irresistible strength that split the metal as though it were made of foil. He raised the axe again and split it crosswise, breaking the teeth into unrecognizable white splinters. Then together they pried the remaining shreds of metal apart. John gathered up the escaped plastic bits and components from inside the skull, using part of the head as a bowl to hold them. Then he got as close to the burning house as he could and flung it into the flames like a frisbee. Dieter looked around. There was nothing left but a few bloodstains on the ground, and the bacteria and ants and monsoon rains would take care of those. He shuddered, feeling slightly nauseous for a second. "Reaction?" Sarah said from beside him. He looked down at her. The fake glasses were gone, and he could see her eyes clearly for once. "Yeah," he said. "I could use a comforting hug." He opened his big arms and turned towards her. Sarah looked at him in disbelief, momentarily disgusted at the thought of hugging what she'd just torn apart. Then she looked at his very human eyes and smiled, then laughed. "Of course," she said, and stepped into his arms. "We Connors provide full-service disasters." She put her own arms around him and rested her cheek against his solid chest. One hand patted his back, making circles, then patting, the way she had with John when he was a baby. Dieter rested his cheek against her hair, and she felt, rather than heard, him sigh. "We've been attacked by a Terminator. My house is burning down and we have to flee Paraguay. But this is rather nice," she thought. Dieter's big hands began to imitate her own, gentle circles and pats. "Am I going into shock?" After a moment, she decided she wasn't. After a longer moment, she decided to let go of von Rossbach and stand alone. But she didn't. Instead, she closed her eyes and sighed. Von Rossbach moved his head to look down at the woman in his arms. He stroked her hair, and Sarah lifted her head to look up at him. She lowered her eyes, smiling slightly. "Comforted?" she asked. "Oh, yes," he said. "Guys," John said. They both moved apart as though he'd thrown water on them. "Yeah," Sarah said, nodding. "You will take Linda," she said to von Rossbach. "Linda?" "The horse," John explained with elaborate patience. "Of course," Dieter said. "You two can come to my place so that we can make plans." "I don't think so," Sarah said. "I think it's best we disappear now." She turned away. "I'll get Linda into the trailer." He grabbed her arm and she spun, yanking her arm free from his grip. "I want to help," Dieter said, willing her to believe him. Feral as she seemed to be going, that belief was going to come hard. "You can't just go off half-cocked. You need to plan this, and I have the resources to help you." "Dieter," John cut in, keeping a wary eye on both of them. "I know you mean well, but you do realize that they probably found us because of you." Von Rossbach's head snapped around to look at him. "You do realize that, don't you?" "I told no one," Dieter insisted. "I denied everything to my colleagues. They didn't find you through me. I swear it." Sarah and John exchanged a look, and she gave a slight jerk of her head towards the barn. John hesitated, and she gave him the look. He rolled his eyes and moved off. After a few yards, she and Dieter could hear muttering. Now Sarah and Dieter looked at each other. She lifted her hand to brush back her hair, then dropped it when she saw the caked blood on her fingers. "Are you really that naive?" Sarah asked. She put her hands on her hips. "Maybe you are. After all, you've never had to fight machines that think before." Sarah drew in a deep breath and then let it out, her eyes on fire for a moment. "You put my name out there. They'd be watching for that." She looked up at him. "And obviously, they can interface with other machines like no human being. Maybe this one was just sent down to check out the possibility that you had seen me. But it isn't going home, and that, I assure you, will alert them to our whereabouts." She held up a finger. "And let's not forget that Victor wasn't too happy with either one of us when he left Villa Hayes the other night. Who knows who he's told?" Von Rossbach drew his mouth into a tight line, and frowning, stared at the bloody dirt beneath his feet. She was probably right. Worse, he didn't know the enemy the way she did. But she had learned, and so could he. He nodded once and looked at her. "I am going to help you," he said. "And I am going with you. I have contacts that you can use, and, forgive me, this isn't a criticism. I have credibility that you do not." He shook his head. "Don't throw away a good tool before you've even examined it, Sarah. I can help you." He looked towards the barn. And him. Sarah's expression was troubled, but all she said was, "Why don't you drive your car down to the barn so that we can hitch you up?" Then she turned and walked away. He would have preferred a direct answer, but he decided to believe that she was thinking it over. By the time the trailer was hitched and the horse loaded, she would have an answer for him. It had better be the right one, he thought, because I can be just as stubborn as she is. "Dieter, we can't go to your estancia," Sarah began after shutting Linda into the trailer. "Sarah," he interrupted, not letting her continue. "Of course we can't go to your place," John cut in, with the eye-rolling exasperation that only a 16-year-old can show for adult obtuseness. "First of all, we can't drag a whole bunch more people into this without someone getting hurt. Second, we are like wanted fugitives on the run again. That doesn't stop, Dieter. That just goes on and on and on. Do you really want to taint your pristine reputation by associating with us?" "I want to help you," von Rossbach said. "You'll need my help. The entire world and the human race in general need my help, if what you've said is true." "We've done okay until now," John said, sounding cocky. "You did okay until your enemies came back and started up the Skynet project at Cyberdyne." Dieter stared at him with no expression on his face, and John shuddered at how much he looked like the enemy. "There's a good chance that I can get you in there," Dieter said. "Their facility is on an army base, underground. And they'll have backup, Sarah, just like last time. I can help you find those locations." He leaned in close to her. "You need me, Sarah." She looked at him, and they stared into each other's eyes for a long time. "You'd follow us even if I said no, wouldn't you?" she asked. "And I'd find you." He straightened. "I was the best Sector had, Sarah." He held out his hands. "Use me." She gave a single explosive laugh. "How could any girl resist that offer?" she said. "Mom!" She held up her hand, and John subsided reluctantly. "Look," Dieter said. "I know you can't just come over and stay in my guest room, but there's a cottage on my property that you can use. It's primitive, but it should be safe for one night, especially since it's over a mile from the house. Tonight we can discuss our options, and tomorrow we'll hit the road." Sarah raised her brows, looked up at her house, burning merrily, glanced at John, whose arms were folded across his chest, and whose frown spoke of his resistance, then smiled at Dieter. "Sure," she said. "Sounds like a plan." She looked around and then gestured towards his Land Rover. "Just let us grab our gear and we'll go." Los Angeles, the present. Frowning, Teresa Dyson put down the phone. She'd been disconcerted by the disconnect message she'd gotten when she'd called Jordan. But she was more troubled by the fact that, according to the phone company, he no longer seemed to have a number in Delaware. Either he'd moved, or he really, really didn't want to talk to her. He could be using a cell phone, I suppose, she thought. That way he could stay in touch with his friends and work. Aha, Teresa thought, and started dialing again. It didn't connect. She put down the phone again and rattled her fingernails on the countertop as she thought. Well, if there's one place on earth that I can get in touch with him sooner or later, it would be at work. Teresa was reluctant to do it. She thought calling someone at work, especially Jordan's work, was rude. But this is kind of an unusual situation. She tapped out the number, her mouth set. FBI. Agent Jordan Dyson, please, Teresa said crisply. I'm sorry, Agent Dyson is no longer with the FBI, ma'am. Can I direct your call elsewhere? Teresa found herself taking in a breath that wouldn't stop, as though some internal valve had become stuck. At last, she managed to choke out a feeble, "What?" "Can I direct your call elsewhere, ma'am?" Teresa thought frantically. Who had Jordan mentioned that he worked with? "Paulson," she said after a moment's thought. "Pat Paulson." She identified herself to the secretary, and in a few minutes the phone was picked up. "Paulson." Agent Paulson, this is Teresa Dyson, Jordan's sister-in-law." Teresa bit her lower lip. "This is a little embarrassing," she said with a little laugh. "But I don't have his current phone number, and I was wondering if you could help me out." Pat felt the corners of her mouth tugging down in surprise. Jordan had always made himself out to be a family man, with his nephew and sister-in-law more or less at the center of his life. Could there have been an argument? Shit. If that was the case, he wouldn't thank her for telling them where he was. "Agent Paulson?" Teresa said anxiously. "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just surprised that you don't know his number or anything." Pat winced. That was smooth. Teresa felt her scalp tighten in apprehension. Whatever was going on here, she didn't think she was going to like it. "Well, he said he had a surprise for us the last time he was here," she explained. "I just need to talk to him about something and I can't find the stupid number." Oh, Pat thought about that. Maybe Jordan just choked when it came to telling his sister-in-law that he was going to work for Cyberdyne. She could understand that. In which case, he might be glad that someone else broke the news. And if he called to ream her out, she could always plead innocence. "Well," she said, "he only left a couple of days ago, and I haven't heard from him yet. Maybe you could get in touch with him through Cyberdyne?" There was a ringing silence at that, and Pat winced again. "Oh," Teresa said at last. It felt as though her eyebrows had disappeared into her hairline. "Well, that certainly is a surprise." She narrowed her eyes and forced herself to sound jaunty. "But it will be great to have him living so close by." Paulson relaxed a little. "I think he'll like that," she said. "He's always talking about you guys." "Well, I'll try to get in touch with him at Cyberdyne then," Teresa said brightly. They said goodbye and hung up. Teresa leaned against the counter, hugging herself as she thought about this. Miles's project. Jordan had anticipated that the Connors would show up to put a stop to it. And he's right, she thought, rubbing the knuckles of one hand against her lower lip. She dropped the hand with a sigh. I wish I knew where they were. I wish I could talk to them. She didn't want to stop them from destroying Cyberdyne. She only wanted to prevent them from killing Jordan, who, meanwhile, will be doing his damnedest to stop them any way he can. She brushed back her hair. Well, she couldn't talk to the Connors, but maybe she could talk to Jordan again. Maybe even get through to him this time. She found the Cyberdyne number and called, was transferred and transferred again, until she found herself speaking to Serena's secretary. I'm trying to locate Jordan Dyson, Teresa said. He's not here at the moment, but I can take a message for him if you'd like. Damn. Well, why not? After being switched hither and yon, Teresa figured that this was the best she was going to do today. Yes, please. Could you tell him that Teresa asks him to please remember what she told him? The secretary's gossiping instincts perked up. Certainly, Ms. Dyson, Teresa said. Miss Dyson, I'll see that he gets your message, ma'am. Thank you. Teresa hung up. Maybe that'll shake him out of his huff, she thought. Maybe not. Maybe only time would do that. I hope not, she thought. I miss him already. Cyberdyne, the present. So, Serena said, ushering Jordan into his new office, we end the grand tour here. This is mine, Jordan said. The office was exactly the same size as Burns's, though more blandly furnished. It was located directly across the hall from hers. Very nice, he thought. Here at Cyberdyne, where there were no windows, status came from the size of your space, and this was about as large as an office could get here. Serena said. For the time being, we'll share my secretary, Mrs. Dupree. If it looks like that will be a burden on her, we'll get you an assistant of your own. Thank you, Jordan said. He was used to sharing a secretary. I'm sure it'll be fine. I'll leave you to get on with your work then, Serena said. I've posted everything we have on the Connor case onto your computer. If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to ask. I meant what I said when I told you that I consider this to be top priority. Jordan looked at the computer. Great, he said. I'll get right on it. She smiled at him, a slow, satisfied smile that sent a little shiver down his spine. I can see you're eager to get to work, she said. So I'll leave you to it. She offered her hand and he took it. Welcome aboard, Mr. Dyson. Great to be here, Ms. Burns. With a nod, Serena pulled his door closed behind her and crossed the hall. She stopped at Dupre's desk, and the secretary looked up with her bird-like brightness. Mrs. Dupre, Serena said confidently. I've told Mr. Dyson that you will be acting as his administrative assistant, as well as my own for the time being. Dupre's face and posture stiffened, and it amused the I-950 to realize that even a human could have read her displeasure. Is it because of his race? she wondered. Or does she think he might be an unredeemed sinner? Not that it mattered to Serena one way or the other. Perhaps she'd been too lenient with Mrs. Dupre. But the woman was a veritable fount of illicit information. Still, maybe it's time to, as she would put it, put the fear of God into her. After all, it wouldn't do to have her gossiping about what went on in the security office. Serena straightened. If that's not to your taste, Mrs. Dupre, perhaps I should have human resources. How she loved that term. Send up a more accommodating secretary. Then you could work for someone else. The secretary's jaw dropped. But I would hate to do that, Mrs. Dupre. I've come to rely on you. Your efficiency, your discretion, these are not common traits. Most of all, I prize your loyalty. Serena allowed herself to look troubled. I wish you would think about it before you decide. She smiled weakly. I've very much enjoyed working with you. Of course I'll stay, the woman said. I've enjoyed working with you too. Serena smiled mistily and offered her hand. The secretary took it, and they had a special moment together. The I-950 squeezed the human's hand slightly. Well, back to work, she said. I'm sure Mr. Dyson won't need you to do things for him too often. Oh, Dupre said, rising. I have a message for him. Why don't you go and give it to him? Serena suggested. It will be a perfect opportunity to get acquainted. I'm relying on you to make him feel welcome. That's a good idea, Miss Burns, the secretary said, rising. She picked up a slip of pink paper and started across the hall, then turned. You know you can rely on me, Miss Burns. I do, Serena said seriously, then entered her office, grinning as she closed the door behind her. Ah, humans, she thought, as she started towards her desk. They provided such great comic relief. She sat down and probed the ether, receiving no answer from her Terminator, meaning that he has been terminated. She felt anger spurt and suppressed it ruthlessly. Useless emotion. What was the point of anger? It interfered with clear thinking, and as far as she could see, had no productive results. Unless you were so primitive that you needed an uncontrolled spurt of hormones for maximum fight-flight efficiency. Obviously, the Connors had been ready for trouble, due, no doubt, to the interference of von Rossbach and Grego. True, they wouldn't have been expecting a Terminator, but they were primed for trouble. With those two, as history had proven again and again, that was all it took. She felt a prickle of disquiet. Or quantum effects could be at work. The inertia of the time stream seeking to bend events back towards the maximum probability. The timeline that had originally seen John Connor destroy Skynet. She hit speed dial for the number that Cassetti had given her. It had amused her at first to know it belonged to a restaurant, and that he was some low-status employee there. Now she was simply impatient as the phone was answered. Mario's, accompanied by the cacophony of a kitchen. Marco Cassetti, she said. Marco? The man bellowed. There was a pause. No, he said. Another pause. He's not here. the man said. "You tell him when you see him that I'm gonna fire him if he doesn't start showing up soon." Then he hung up. Serena sat, phone in hand, and thought. Cassetti could have instructed his friends at the restaurant to say he wasn't there, which would mean that he must have seen or known about the Terminator's termination. She hung up the phone as it began to bleat. She could hire someone to check it out, but decided not to muddy the waters any further. After all, the restaurant man might have been telling the truth, which would mean that the Terminator had eliminated Cassetti before it was itself destroyed. The important thing now was that the Connors were alerted, and they were coming. Soon. She smiled. A very comprehensive set of military history records had been among her downloads. The history of the U-boat campaigns was among them. Submarines had been an unanswerable weapon as long as warships tried to find them. Hunting through the wastes of water. The ocean was too big. The answer was to group all the merchantmen into a convoy and surround it with warships. Then the submarine had to come to you. New York City, the present. Ron LeBain opened the envelope marked "Personal and Confidential" and pulled out the newspaper clipping within. He checked but found no note, and there was no return address on the envelope. With a quirk of lips and brows, he shook the piece open and started to read. Soon he was chuckling richly. The article concerned a university professor who'd been found near smothered by methane, tied to a stake driven into the middle of a lake of pig feces, adjacent to a gigantic hog factory farm. The good professor had conducted a study of such farms and had concluded that their impact on rural communities was minimal. I wonder if he still feels the same way, Ron thought. The article went on to list the complaints of the people who lived near to the hog factory, including the horrible smell and the resultant drop in property values in the nearby town. A local environmentalist talked about how runoff from the lake of feces had contaminated local streams and the ponds and lakes they ran into. He also suggested that the wells that many of the area's farms relied on were no longer safe. Ron folded up the piece and put it back into its envelope. It seemed that the Fab Four had taken his advice. He looked forward to their next escapade. He rose and took the article to his secretary. "How could we get this picked up by the wire services?" he asked her. She took the envelope from him and read its contents, then laughed out loud. "Let me take care of it," she said, her eyes dancing. "I know just who to call."